Hey everybody, thank you for joining us today. We are going to talk about a topic near and dear to my heart, and I am looking forward to sharing my knowledge on this and hopefully helping to inspire and establish even more paid internships for libraries, archives, and museums. Without further ado, we are going to talk about how to create paid internships. A few notes on me, just in case this is the first webinar you've attended that I have done. I am a business owner, author, speaker, educator, advocate, and consultant. My firm is 5+ years now, almost 6, and it's Rachel Christine Consulting. For me, I've spent more than 15 years in the archives and museum field with the benefit of working with dozens of different types of organizations of all shapes and sizes. And as pertinent to the topic that we are discussing today, I've done advocacy work on the ARCS committee. I've served on SAA's Committee on Public Awareness, the Ad Hoc Salary Group, and I am the co-founder and creator of the Northwest Archivist in Residence program, which is a fully paid internship program offered by Northwest Archivists. So just a few notes on housekeeping. This session is pre-recorded so that we can deliver the maximum amount of information to you. As we go through this, if there are links to resources or resources that I mentioned throughout, links of those will be available on the resources slides, but they'll also be put in the chat box. Speaking of the chat box, I think we figured it out, so it should be working for us. If you have a YouTube account, you can comment on the chat, what have you. If you don't have an account or don't want to comment, you should still be able to see the chat. Either way, it should be working for us again. And then just a reminder to please respect my content. This is all of my own intellectual work, unless otherwise correctly cited in my slide deck as someone else's work. So just please be respectful about that. And final note, this particular video player, if you're not already viewing this in YouTube, then this is a YouTube player. If you're not familiar with it, the bottom bar of the video, as you hover over it, will have both closed captioning options, as well as the option to make whatever you are viewing full screen to the particular device you are using. So a couple notes there just to help your viewership. Okay, quick disclaimer. I am not an HR specialist nor a specialist in legal or tax things. Not only am I not a specialist, but there will also be different laws and different policies depending on where you live and what type of organization you're in. So there can be a degree of specificity and it depends depending on where you are. However, many of the strategies that we're going to talk about today should be applicable for you. And I definitely encourage you to, as you apply these strategies and the information we cover today, just familiarize yourself with your particular state labor laws as they may pertain to internships, as well as what your organization's policy may be regarding definitions of interns versus regular employees or contractors. So here's our outline. We have a fairly ambitious agenda. We're going to first cover the why paid internships part. I am assuming because you are here is that you're at least a little bit of a fan of paid internships. So these particular talking points for you may already be like, well, duh, I know that, but they can be helpful for you to share with the other people who are not on board yet. I do want to define what an intern is and talk about some of the criteria eligibility that I have worked with in the programs I've established. We are going to talk about a framework for decision making. I have found that doing this exercise ahead of creating the program makes the decisions you contemplate afterwards that much easier to make. We'll then briefly cover how programs can be financially formatted. There's a few different ways according to the IRS, how things can be defined, and that will be helpful to inform you and then apply your state or organization policies. We'll go over complications that can exist and then countering with other benefit considerations. We will spend some time on scoping the work for a valuable internship because while I do advocate that it should be a paid internship, we also want to make sure that it should be a quality internship. So I have some criteria for that as well for you to consider. Also, a critical piece of this content, if we are paying interns, one of the main questions is, how much do I even pay them? So we are going to go over how to do the math for figuring out appropriate compensation. And then we will talk about strategies for funding a paid internship, because then that is also the next immediate question of how we're going to pay for it. So we'll cover all of that. And then we did have quite a bit of excellent questions that were submitted ahead of time. So we'll have a pretty extensive Q&A pre-recorded, and then we can of course do more Q&A in the chat as we go along. So why paid internships? Paid internships support diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives. The acronym I typically use as established in the museum field is DEI, but of course, any variety of ways those words show up for you in your organization, they will likely be included in some sort of policy if you don't already have pillars or initiatives established. So just know that whatever it is that you call it or whatever your acronym is, paid internships support DEI. Paid internships also support a healthier field. We have health in a few different formats: mental health, emotional well-being, etc., as well as financial health. And so as we pay people their worth and help compensate for their time, we alleviate economic pressures if the internship was otherwise unpaid, as well as just the psychology of being paid for work versus not. So there are a few different ways as to why this makes it healthier, not just for the intern, but then the reverb effects of creating a healthier field, mostly economically speaking, but as well as mentally, just knowing that we're all valued a little bit more. With paid internships, it supports a better pipeline of talent. So the more interns we're able to help support through paid internship opportunities, the more people who have incredible talents and knowledge are able to gain that critical real life experience. And therefore, the better the professionals are that we end up hiring into our organizations, because they were able to access those critical real life learning opportunities. Paid internships do support higher wages for everyone. I want to hit this one a little harder because some of the resistance around paid internships comes from people saying, well, I didn't have a paid internship, or well, I only get paid this much dollars an hour. Why are they getting paid kind of mentality? And it's a false equivalency, first of all. And second, in the effects of paying interns, that will raise the value of and the awareness of the value of those other people within the organization. So it will not be an effect that happens immediately, but it is an effect that will happen if you establish paid internships. So just want to highlight that for everybody who have colleagues that are resistant because of that's how it's always been, and they're afraid that they will be paid less kind of mentality. Also, paid internships support learning experiences for new professionals and organizations' capacity to execute projects. So as we know, we never have enough staff to do all of the things we want to do. So having qualified, interested, and well-compensated interns will help us finish or at least execute a few more projects than we otherwise would have been able to do. So in terms of adding to this list, in terms of adding some academic sources to cite to this list, at the end of this deck are several different resource slides with just like a sampling of different articles you can read to get more ideas, more detail, as well as see some of the academic arguments that are much more eloquent than I could describe in terms of the economic, racial, gender, various disparities across the board. So, as well as ideas of how to counter that. So you have plenty of reading material should you need it. All right, now Northwest Archivists has an Archivist in Residence program. This is the program that I co-founded and also co-funded. The idea came in 2018. It took a year and a half or so for us to get the program up and running, establish program criteria, establish an application and scoring rubric, etc., as well as fundraising. So since then, we've been able to establish the program. We've been able to have paid residencies or paid internships for the last 3 years, 2020, 2021, and 2022. And the program has officially moved to permanency at Northwest Archivists. So we're thrilled for it to become a permanent program and funded in part, at least, by the Northwest Archivists annual budget, and are very grateful to our sponsored partners too for making that part possible. And in addition to establishing this regional opportunity, I've also helped other organizations establish their paid internships. For example, Northwest Archivists, the Archivist in Residency program has now inspired and established further paid internship programs with the Southwest Archivists as well as the Rocky Mountain Archivists. So it's been nice to see the idea gain traction and spread to some of our other peer organizations. So with part of this work, and I encourage you to check out not just the Archivist in Residence webpage, but also a blog post that is an example of what the residencies look like by one of our residents. From those sources, you'll be able to get a sense of what our eligibility criteria is. There's the link on the webpage where you can see what that document looks like. I encourage you to borrow heavily from it, as well as you can access the application that we're currently using for these opportunities, and also you are welcome to use that as well. For this particular opportunity, it is a co-application between a host institution and an intern, because this is a regional offering. Both the organization and the potential intern apply. So you can, of course, adapt and take relevant questions as you need if you're the actual organization going to fund the internship directly. All right, an intern is, so this particular set of bullet points is not set in stone per se. There's, at least as far as I know, not a definitive source or criteria as to what an intern is, but in doing the work that I have with establishing several different regional residencies at this point, as well as the experience of establishing paid opportunities at Linfield College and other organizations, I do have a bit of experience in terms of crafting criteria. So this is what I recommend. I recommend you also go through this exercise and determine what is appropriate for you. So with that said, an intern is not age dependent. An intern is someone who has an undergraduate or graduate program. They're either in it currently or recently, and recent is qualified as like within 2 years, recently graduated. They're someone who is new to the field and is just starting out their career. And the reason why I have this included is because it is a paid internship program. We can often see a lot of people applying who have been in the field for 10 years versus really an internship is oriented and intended to give experience to someone who's new to the field. Anyone who has more knowledge and experience than that should really be a paid employee. An intern is someone who possesses knowledge and skills for the field, but they just lack that real world application. And I do want to emphasize that that's part of the reason why these internships should be paid. Most of our interns are going to be graduate level, so they have at least 6 years of schooling, and they have that expertise and they have an advanced skill set versus just someone general off the street, so to speak. So with that in mind, they absolutely should be paid, because they are bringing that with them, but also with the understanding that this is a learning experience. And then an intern is someone who will likely have student loan debt, may still be attending classes, holds at least one job, and who likely has familial care responsibilities. So, in grad school, and especially for the library, archives, and museum field, we are a field of sort of second careerers. So, people who have had a first career and then they decide to go back to school and train in any of the library, archive, and museum fields, and are then now seeking internships in their 30s, 40s, and even 50s age wise. So it's important to remember that these aren't just kids where all they're doing is going to school and that's it. And even if they were, they still may have other responsibilities, as do the rest of us. So I just want to remind people these are not kids where mommy and daddy is paying for everything typically. And in fact, that assumption has been so detrimental to having a diverse field. So we just need to really understand that these people are people who have other things going on, and we need to have empathy and respect for that and account for it. Part of the way we account for that is to make sure that they are paid. So, if the potential intern is not new to their career in the field nor recently graduated, then they're actually potential employees and not interns. Okay, creating a framework for decision making. This part is important because as you start forming what your program looks like, as you start making decisions towards how it's formatted financially, what your scoring rubric may be, any of those types of questions, it's going to be predicated on whatever your value set is. And if you have not intentionally set what that value set is, then you're going to be making decisions that may be somewhat inconsistent with each other and may be somewhat counterintuitive to the actual goal of you establishing a paid internship. So I want to have two things that are part of your value set as you move forward in making those decisions. The first one is that you need to center the intern, their well-being, and their professional experience while at your organization. Whenever you come up against a question or like a what do we do, prioritize the one that is the best decision for that potential intern. And then the second thing I want you to keep in mind is that the intern should not incur debt in order to access the internship opportunity. So this means no school credit in lieu of pay. This means no underpaid or unpaid work. This means no expectation for them to relocate, especially if it involves across the country or across an ocean, and no expectation that they cover room and board if they do end up relocating for the duration of the internship. I want to pull out the example here because one of the common refrains from some of our more stuck in their ways colleagues, and the outdated refrain I may add, is that, well, they need the experience and they get credit for it. Like that's the deal we made, essentially, is sort of the assumption. And while that has certainly been past practice, that does not make it accurate or ethical. So thinking about it and thinking about just the numbers of that, if a student is coming to do an unpaid internship because they're getting credit for it, and that's the justification, that means that the student is paying for the internship experience. It's not cost neutral. Not only are they not getting paid for that work, they're actually paying the school for that privilege of having an internship. They have to pay for those credits. So they're going into several $1,000s of debt that way by owing for the credits, as well as any amount of hours that they spend doing that unpaid internship means hours that they can't then spend doing paid work. As someone who had to work her entire way through college and grad school, having to do the 8 to 16 hours of internship a week on top of my 30-hour job, on top of a full graduate course load, is a bit much. Quite frankly, it's ridiculous. So we should not be forcing that upon the graduate students by trying to justify this antiquated and exploitive work system. And just to keep in mind that if they're getting credit, that means that they're actually paying even more for this internship experience. Okay, so how can programs be financially formatted? There are three main avenues. The first two are much more common, but we will cover all three just in case. The first one is employment. The second one is as an award or stipend. And the third is as a contractor. So I'm going to show you the IRS definition of a common law employee, and then we'll also have an IRS definition of an award or stipend. And I want to point out that for the IRS, for a common law employee, this is typical of a business setting. So this is a for-profit situation. And the definition for a common law employee is anybody who performs work or services where you, as that organization's representative, can control what will be done and how it will be done. So this may not necessarily seem different from an internship, but know that that's the IRS definition and that this is typically for profit. So let's get into some of that detail. So employment may make sense for your organization if you are from a for-profit company versus a nonprofit museum, for example, and or if the internship is intended to last 12 months or longer. If it's going to be shorter than 12 months, then why are you going through the hiring and employment process for a very temporary worker? Also, the implications are that if the interns are employees, then that means that they're going to trigger certain criteria for benefits, and that includes unemployment benefits. So it's actually quite costly to treat interns as employees because of the laws and the policies at your organization that will get triggered as a result. Also, employer and employee taxes will come out of that amount paid. Now, when you're a regular employee, that's fine. Your salary is calculated accordingly. When you are an intern, that is not fine, and the salary is often not calculated appropriately. So just know that whatever funding was set aside, if it then gets set up as an employment position, the intern is going to get significantly less than you had intended. All right, so grants to individuals, which is like the awards or stipends category for us. This is going to be available if you're a charity or nonprofit, so 501c3. And there's two things that are key here for you to meet this criteria. So the grant has to be awarded on an objective, non-discriminatory basis. So this is where having an application and scoring rubric comes in as helpful, because you can establish and prove that there is a process in place to help support objective and non-discriminatory practices. And then what is typically most common for meeting a second criteria is 2C. So the grant's purpose is to achieve a specific objective, produce a report, some sort of product. And so if you're structuring your internship correctly, which we'll get into shortly, then you will certainly meet criteria 2C as well. So just to sort of recap for you here, on awards, so like that granting situation, an award makes sense if you are a nonprofit organization, if the internship is intended to last 12 months or fewer, and if you're able to solicit applications and award on that objective, non-discriminatory basis, and where the award's purpose is to fund that person producing or achieving an objective. The implications for that is that an award is given. It is not earned in a traditional like clock the hours sense. There's not going to be a time card, so to speak, for this person. They're not an employee. That does not mean that you can't have expectations of you should come in Monday through Thursday, 9 to 5, for example. So that is something that you can establish ahead of time, but just know that you're not going to be making this person clock in and clock out. Also, it's recommended that you create program criteria and an evaluation rubric to meet the IRS regulations, that the internship isn't subject to employee benefits and to some extent policies at your organization. So that was a impact implication if they are an employee. In this case, that is not at play here. The organization, if doing an award, the only tax thing they need to do for this part is to issue a 1099 at the end of the calendar year, which is similar if the person was a contractor. And for the intern side of this, less taxes are taken out. So there's not the typical employer or employee taxes. And so the awardee, or intern in this case, is responsible for much less taxes and gets a much bigger chunk of that award for their work. So that is typically more financially preferable, especially if you're not able to increase the award as if they were an employee. And then the third piece is hiring them essentially as a contractor, so like a temporary employee for a dedicated purpose. This might make sense if the internship is intended to last like a minimum of 6 months. And typically establishing a contract, going out to bid, etc., takes a good amount of time. So you don't want to do it for anything less than 6 months, is my point. And this may be a good option if you don't want to hire an employee, but you also, for whatever reason, don't meet the IRS criteria to provide the award. Implications are that the organization will likely need to go through the RFP/bid process, and you may not receive bids from persons looking for a paid internship experience. Specifically, you may not receive bids from newer graduates, those who fit that internship criteria that we just spoke of. So the chances of you actually targeting and attracting the base of people that you want is going to be harder. Also, the contractor isn't subject to employee benefits and to some extent policies, so for better or worse. The organization, as was the case for the award, you issue a 1099 at the end of the calendar year. And the contractor, which is the intern in this case, is responsible for all taxes. So there's going to be that employer-employee tax responsibility, but the intern in this case is responsible for all of it as a contractor, which means that you need to compensate that person even more than you would an employee or someone who's getting an award for that matter. Because that person is then going to have to turn around and pay that amount of taxes. So just know that typical contract guidelines and rules apply here, even if you're doing contracting for an intern. Complications that can exist. So especially after these last few years, we can definitely summarize a few challenges that may come up and just for you to be aware of. Number one, pandemics. So we've recently gone through the COVID-19 pandemic. Hopefully that's the only pandemic for the next 100 years. But the point being, how much our lives were disrupted these last few years could happen again. And so just knowing that there's going to be a certain amount of adaptivity needed in order to accommodate for and support internships. Next, the reality of the other commitments and time restrictions due to the intern's lifestyle, for example, grad school classes, another job, a family, inherently means that that person is going to not be as available as you may expect an employee to be. They have much more responsibility than someone who's going through a more typical, normal, graduated, don't have a family, for example, kind of lifestyle. Also, updating an organization to work with persons of all abilities. While this isn't specific to internships, I do want to raise it here because organizations are woefully behind trying to provide equitable opportunities for people of all abilities. And so for internships, knowing that we're wanting to one of the reasons to have paid internships is to increase diversity and inclusion. Well, we can't do that if we're then not also offering the equitable opportunity of being able to support a person with varied abilities from another more typical workforce, for example. So that is a bit of a challenge, especially when it's sort of counterintuitive to the goal that we're trying to achieve with paid internships. Also, outdated policies that makes establishing an internship program unnecessarily challenging. And based on some of the questions we're going to get into a little bit later in this webinar, this is like the biggest sticking point for so many of us trying to champion and put forth a paid internship program for the first time. So we'll get into some strategies there, but just know that that typically is a sticking point for everybody. And it is silly and aggravating, but there are some ways we can get through it. Also, outdated views in support of exploitative labor models. I can't tell you how many ridiculous reasons I have heard to not have paid internships that can all be debunked with any amount of critical thinking. And so one thing I would recommend to you is that if you're confronted with some of these silly, like, well, we can't do it because they get credit for it, or we can't do it because it costs money, kind of like whatever, or, what are we supposed to do? Turn people away if we can't pay them, kind of thing, then they can't get experience. So anyway, when you do hear those things, I would encourage you doing some like somewhat neutral curiosity and exploring where they're coming from with these like knee-jerk reactions. And as you explore those, you find that there's really not a lot of substance behind their resistance. So if that comes up, and if you feel up to engaging with it, then creating and adopting that culture of curiosity is usually the most successful. And then finally, organization budgets with insufficient funding allocated for paid internships. As we know so much for libraries, archives, and museums, we are critically underfunded. However, there are some things I believe we can do with budgets, especially if we're prioritizing as an organization diversity, equity, and inclusion. You can really tell by an organization's operating budget whether they're really putting their money where their mouth is, so to speak, on DEI. And that means that they need to be offering living wages for their employees, competitive wages, market rate wise, as well as paid internship experiences. So I am suggesting that there is some additional critical thinking that can be done in analyzing the budget and making some different decisions. All right, getting into some of the other benefit considerations, and I noticed I left off the second quote there. But thinking about other benefits, knowing that as we work towards paid internships, it's sometimes a step-by-step iterative process. And so if you can't offer the full amount or as much as you would like to, there are some additional benefits we can provide interns so that it's still as valuable experience as possible for them. So when thinking about professional development benefits here, we can offer networking opportunities when they're in our organization, including them in meetings, especially committee work, can be incredibly valuable for them. They've never been exposed to that before, at least in this field, and it's certainly not a class that they're taking. Also, professional presentation opportunities. So if there's any sort of local conference happening or even just like an in-organization presentation, having those sort of opportunities is so valuable. And then, of course, creating a report, poster, paper, anything that they could point to as part of their portfolio, that they can include as part of their resume, all of those will be incredibly beneficial for them. And just a note here that for these specifically, these benefits help to grow the intern as a professional, and it centers their experience, which, as you may recall from our framing of values to help with decisions, one of the two was centering the intern's experience as the priority. And then benefits continued, cost mitigation. So to the best of our ability and through creative means, trying to help neutralize the cost of living, whether it's through a stipend, housing, or offering room and board, any sort of neutralizing or partial payments, like seriously getting creative about it. Transportation reimbursement or provisions. So maybe you can provide public transit pass or mileage reimbursement. Also, depending on what sort of organization you are or where you're located, there may be memberships or discounts that you can offer to the interns. And then also meals provided if there's a cafe on site or nearby, what have you, being able to help subsidize or supplement some of the costs there by helping to feed them can sometimes be nice. And these benefits help to neutralize costs incurred by the intern, which is the second of the two from that value framework. Okay, as far as scoping the work for a valuable internship, I want you to think about these three prompts as you start putting this together. What can the intern work on that adds value to the collection while also providing valuable career experience? What experiences can the organization provide the intern that will make them a more competitive future applicant? And what projects have supports in place where the intern can engage in an active learning space and having it be a safe space for them? Because they're interns, they will be very careful, but mistakes may happen, and it's completely reasonable for mistakes to happen. They are learning, so make sure it's a safe space for them to feel like they can do that. Okay, still thinking about scoping, but getting into a specific, like what should these projects look like? They should be discrete, start to finish kind of projects, because of course we want that intern to have a completed result. It should produce some sort of product or deliverable, whether you're trying to meet IRS guidelines or not. This is still a component that should be a part of your internship experience. It grows the intern as a professional, so it needs to be more than like pulling staples. It needs to actually provide them real life experience to apply their extensive graduate level knowledge and skills. And it should be a project that wouldn't otherwise be completed by paid staff. So make sure that it's something that it makes sense for an intern to do versus something that like head of the department should do. And it should be a project that supports their learning and can absorb their mistakes. And then finally, an internship must have, in order to be successful, a dedicated supervisor, someone who is available to them at 90% of the time that they may need you. They must have training as they get started, and then easily accessible instructions that they can constantly refer to as they start applying their knowledge and skills. They need to have regular check-ins. So with that dedicated supervisor, to make sure the intern has what they need and that the project is progressing according to established guidelines and your instructions. And then they have to have a place to work with equipment and supplies. Even if the internship is remote, because of course we've just gone through pandemic and internships in a pandemic. So many of the internships can now creatively be done remotely, but that still means you should make sure that they have what they need, both in terms of accessing a supervisor and getting that oversight, as well as the equipment that they may need. For example, perhaps you can rent out a laptop to them if they don't have one, kind of thing. Internships should not include the following. So I do not want to hear about interns that are pulling staples, taking rubber bands off things, refiling, relabeling, or endless scanning. That is not graduate level work, people. If they are pulling the occasional staple, that is fine. If they are doing some relabeling as part of a larger project, that is fine. But it is so much a waste of their time and knowledge and expertise to do that kind of menial labor. So please be more thoughtful than that. Also, as you will notice, there's no like product or objective achieved if that is all that they're doing. Also, work that is clearly for a permanent paid position. So you shouldn't be expecting an intern to be creating a department policy, for example, or writing grants, for heaven's sakes. Also, work that is beyond their current learning or abilities. So, reasonable expectations here based on what you understand of their graduate program and the curriculum that they've achieved. And program decisions, fundraising, performing outreach to underinvited communities, and other items that are inappropriate for an intern to engage in due to their internship status. If you have questions on that, we should talk offline. Okay, doing the math. So I do have a whole webinar on how to calculate your worth and subsequently the worth of any other sort of position, including a paid internship position. So we're going to refrain from going into all of the resources that you could reference to get that sort of information. If you haven't already watched the How Much Am I Worth webinar and you do want more help around the math piece of this, go watch that webinar. And we're going to get right into the equation part of this. So this is a sample budget from last year. So keep in mind, it has not gone through the 9% inflation that has happened this year. But it's a budget from last year's Northwest Archivist in Residence program. And these are two different sample budgets. Because it's a regional program in a large region, we have different locations that are incredibly expensive to live in or definitely not as expensive to live in. So we have two different examples here where you can see we're taking into account the location, minimum wage of that location, as well as calculated living wage, which you can find out through the MIT Living Wage Calculator, which is one of the resources in the other webinar. And then I want you to consider things like, have they completed their master's degree, for example, or are they just starting? Because there's different knowledge gained and perhaps different experience levels happening there, as well as what sort of experience have they gathered thus far? Is there technical expertise at work? How much oversight or training are they going to need? And so balancing that in terms of what are they already coming with that they should be compensated for? Or is this going to be like a really brand new learning experience? And so even though living wage is very high and we will pay appropriately, it may be closer to a starting wage, for example. At no point should either of these in either location be minimum wage. Paid internships in libraries, archives, and museums for positions that require a master's degree or more should be more than minimum wage. You're killing me, people, with the minimum wage for the paid internships. Like, I am glad you were paying them. So, like, good job there. But now we need to increase that to a more appropriate compensation level. All right, strategies for funding a paid internship program. There are so many, but the first one I want you to start with, because perhaps it may take the longest to see the fruits of your labor, is questioning and pushing up against your operating budget. Again, you may recall earlier in this webinar, I suggested that an organization's commitment could be measured by how diversity, equity, and inclusion is shown in its operating budget, by how it pays its employees, and by how it compensates its interns. So I encourage you to start there, knowing that you'll get resistance and it may take a few times, but you should definitely start here if you want any sort of sustainable, long-term, robust internship program. In the meantime, or if the operating budget is a no-go zone for whatever reason, fundraising. So this can be ad hoc fundraising, it can be events. I mean, depending on the organization you're at, there are likely other fundraising events throughout the year. So coordinating with your organization in terms of what sort of events does it make sense to hopefully attach a paid internship fundraiser to, or hosting your own. There are several different ways you could go about it creatively here. So considering fundraising. Related, but I don't want to call this out separately, is considering company sponsorship. So depending on your local companies, depending on your collections and where there may be somewhat corporate interest, things like that, consider companies that may be willing to pitch in a couple $100 or maybe a couple $1,000 Because as we saw by the math, if you're doing like a 3 month internship, and depending on your locality, you could definitely get something funded for like 5 to 6. I mean, it would be great if we got $10,000 a year, but like currently $5,000 to $6,000, you could put together a pretty nice 3 month internship. And that's not a lot of money for companies. So if you offer a little like, hey, would you sponsor this? Not only is it like the right thing to do and helps the children, but we'll also put your company logo on like whatever product they create, whether it's a finding aid or maybe social media posts. So a little bit of like company feels good kind of stuff. Also for donors, internships and anything to do with students or student learning, regardless of the age of the student, is viewed very favorably by both donors and grants. So I encourage you to think about the donors from your organization, and if you have someone to work with department wise, please do. Otherwise, get creative with some donor cultivation and putting together the idea of a paid internship. If not going for the full program, maybe you start with like a pilot project. And then again, like several $1,000s can be quite doable, especially if it's someone who's a regular donor to your organization. And then, of course, grants. Grants are a great avenue to get student employee funding and or paid internships, depending on how they're classified. And so while it can't necessarily be like the whole grant per se, because you should still write about like what that intern is doing, they do tend to, grant reviewers view very favorably the funding of these types of opportunities. And especially for grants, because we're moving into such a DEI focus to help catch up to where we should be, knowing that paid internships help support DEI efforts means that you're all that more attractive as a grant applicant. So remember that it may take time to achieve your vision of a robust, healthy paid internship program, and that is okay. And if that frustrates you, as it does me, that is okay too. Just remember to keep pushing that Overton window. The more an idea is verbalized, the more familiar people become, and the less resistance they then feel towards that idea over time. So keep up the good work, essentially keep pushing, and you will eventually get there. Fingers crossed for you. And now we're going to get into some Q&A. As I mentioned, we did get quite a bit of good questions. So we'll present the question and then walk through some of the answers together. Our first one is, we're designing the program with intent to support diversity of all types in the field. While being a member of a historically and archivally excluded community isn't a requirement for the fellowship position, it could be part of the equation. We're struggling with how to envision the word so that we're not engaging in discriminatory employment practices. We know we can't ask demographics, so are thinking along the lines of explaining the diversity building goals of the fellowship and then asking a question like, do you have lived or other experience that would support the goals of this fellowship? Yes or no? So I do want to affirm that your impulse to state the diversity, equity, and inclusion goals is good. You're on the right track here. This helps to set the intention for the program, and also affirming that your concern that you stated around the potential, asking the potential intern to self-disclose demographics or lived experience is probably a no-go zone, if not from HR policy-wise, then certainly from an ethical perspective. So what I've seen work well here, and what has worked well with the archivist in residence for NWA, is the organization stated DEI intention, because that signals to any of your applicants that that is part of the program's DNA, so to speak. And so if they feel inclined, they can share as they wish how that aligns or perhaps dovetails with their own experience or background. And also you can require something like a cover letter, or maybe there's some application questions that ask the potential interns to identify their career goals and how they see the internship supporting their path. And then another prompt that asks how their past educational or professional experiences makes them an excellent candidate for the opportunity. So as you can tell, these are appropriately professionally focused, but it does give that person the opportunity to share some personal things about themselves if they wish, to help indicate that they are also acknowledging that DEI component and how that fits into their own life values or career values kind of things. So I don't think you make it a requirement that they address it, but I do think you ask them some thoughtful questions focused on their career and their professionalism. Question: how do most institutions handle the issue of housing for their interns? So if they're in a fairly populous area and they're not an organization with on-campus housing, so they're not a school essentially, then it's typically up to the intern. Many academic institutions who do have the option of housing tend to arrange whether formal housing dorms set aside, or there may be more informal housing through like an Airbnb-esque network. So for example, when I was at Linfield, they had discounted dorm housing available for the summer, but there was also a network of staff and faculty that had extra rooms or EDUs or what have you, where they lent for free or low cost so that students or potential interns could stay near or on campus. Following up, are interns expected to find their own housing and transportation? So in a populous area, again, typically yes. If it's a rural or difficult area to travel to, then housing should proactively be problem solved for by the organization offering the internship. Otherwise, you may get no applicants because they have no way of getting there. And remember, the goal is to not have the intern go into debt in order to access the internship opportunity. This is counter to supporting the DEI initiatives that we're trying so hard to align paid internships with. All right, what are the pros and cons of offering on-campus housing as part of an internship? So check your organization's guidelines regarding housing first. If housing even is an option, there will be some sort of policy that you'll need to be familiar with. The pro of it is that you can support and encourage a more diverse and talented pool of applicants with housing. The con of it is that it means that the school may lose money on that room. So there's not a lot of downside other than they can't charge for that room or not as much for that room, which I don't have a lot of sympathy for an organization to not realize that money, especially in support of diversity, equity, and inclusion programs like paid internships. But do know that that is a downside. It costs somebody money. What are some arguments I can use to convince administration that offering an on-campus housing option, while pricey, could be very beneficial for both the intern and the department where the intern is serving? So excellent, like strategic thinking here in terms of anticipating the pain point and where the resistance may come from and how you can counter that. And so I think definitely starting out with DEI, especially as pretty much all academic institutions right now are trying to catch up with the work that needs to be done here. And it limits, as a result, the paid internship and the subsidized housing limits that financial and logistical barrier that so many potential interns may face. Also, having the subsidized opportunity for housing encourages a more diverse and talented applicant pool, and it's the right slash ethical thing to do. So there's a line that pundits somewhat joke about, but it is so effective, and that's whatever argument you are making, figure out how it impacts the children. So no matter what the topic is, if you can agree that we should prioritize children, then whatever that decision is the right decision. So My suggestion is using a think of the children sort of persuasion, of which for the institution will is essentially like shame them to do the right thing. Like if it gets to it, shame the institution. I am not huge on shaming, but I am okay shaming an institution that is not doing the right thing. Question: we currently get $1,500 from a partner organization for a 5-week internship. Parentheses, not really enough money or time for the students or the staff. I 100% agree. We hold the organization's records. They want them digitized. We asked them to fund a $5,000 internship focused on scanning and metadata, and they're willing to, but there's an 80-year-old professor emeritus involved in approving the funding who doesn't seem to understand inflation, so we ended up with $1,500. I am so angry for you. So let's get into it. It makes 0 sense for an organization to accept less money than what the donor is willing to pay for. Also, unpaid internships are a thing of the past for several economic, ethical, and cultural reasons. And I would suggest to the higher ups that the professor needs to get up to speed or recuse themselves from having a vote on something they fundamentally don't understand. Finally, I would show them how pathetic the math is. And this last strategy here is so effective. I have seen it at work, so do try it. Do the math, the 1,500, and I'm assuming you said the internship was 5 weeks, so 40 hours full time for those 5 weeks, 200 hours, right? So 1,500 divided by 200 hours is $7.50 an hour. That is probably not minimum wage where you're at, let alone living wage. Quite frankly, it's ridiculous because also these internships are going to be highly knowledgeable, highly experienced physicians. So some people don't get it until they see how embarrassing the math is. So give that a try. Next question. Our HR insists we put the interns into the city's payroll system as hourly employees rather than allowing a stipend, so some of the money is going to taxes, etc., even though the amount is negligible. 1, why is HR insisting on that method of payment? And 2, how can I lobby for better funding? So excellent questions here. First one, why is HR insisting on this method of payment? So first of all, affirming it is completely reasonable that you do not have an expert grasp on the possible laws or HR policies at play here. So that is to hopefully affirm, like, you asked great questions and it makes sense that you don't have the answers because, quite frankly, HR should be having these answers. So with that in mind, I would ask them, HR that is, to show you the law or the policy or regulation or whatever as to what they base their decision on as to why the internship has to go through the employment system. My guess is that they don't understand how to legally execute the IRS sanctioned award, which we went over earlier in this webinar. So if that is the case, the good news is that it's pretty straightforward, but definitely ask them for some details onto what that decision was based on. And this is a great strategy, regardless of topic. If somebody tells you no, they can't do it, or no, we have to do it this way, ask them for the policy because 90% of the time there isn't one. Next question, how can I lobby for better funding? Okay, first, figure out what your blockers are, whether they are policies and or people. So for the previous one, we know it's something in the HR department, could be a policy if it exists, definitely at least one person. Gather allies from the blocking department or above the blocking department. So if there's somebody else in the HR department that is a little easier to like explore problem solving around this with, is great. Or go around them, above them. 3, solve the problem slash figure it out for them. So if it's really just that they don't understand the IRS regulation for how to offer correctly and legally an award, now you know how that works. So you can help show them. Number 4, demonstrate how a stipend is more cost effective to the city because the city won't be responsible for taxes nor employee benefits that should be afforded to the intern if they are put on the city's payroll. And with an asterisk here, quite frankly, this is actually what concerns me, that it's not concerning them, the HR person, just because of the inherent cost and all of the things it triggers by the intern becoming an employee. And then 5, show them the evidence as to why it should be funded and formatted in a more efficient way. All of those things should hopefully make a very compelling case. Next question. Also, if I spend too much time each year on the proposal, my library director talks of nixing the whole thing, as no other location in the public library system needs paid interns. This one makes me tired. First of all, I am sorry. That has to be so frustrating. And also, I imagine you are not alone. I have a set here that should help. At the end of the day, though, if you're not getting much support from your library director, I would say gather some allies around them. So let's get into some of the details here. Argument number 1 is that it's the right slash ethical thing to do. And while that may seem so obvious, to start there. Number 2, it supports DEI initiatives. So like, again, it's the right thing to do, but sometimes pointing out that it's meeting like a strategic initiative for the organization is somehow more persuasive. Number 3, it supports the organization's mission, strategic plan, etc. So even if it's not meeting directly DEI, which of course it does, there are usually other strategic pillars or whatever the school calls them at the time, or city or what have you, where it is providing and paid internship can support those different initiatives. So get a little creative there. Also, quote, X project will never get done without an intern. So pointing out like, it doesn't actually matter that no other library needs an intern. That's a false equivalency. But if that doesn't go over well, telling them that, then try the opposite approach of demonstrating why you need a paid intern, because you have this amazing project that will otherwise be done. Also, once you establish the program, it's very easy to run it in maintenance mode. So once you've done all this work to make decisions and establish a program, it's much easier to run after that. And so sometimes I think when library directors see staff time spending time on things that they don't value, they're worried that the staff are spending too much time, which is a whole other thing. So pointing out that all of this work is an investment and it's a one-time investment, and from there on will be very easy in maintenance mode. And then use the think of the children strategy here. You're providing valuable experience to future professionals, and the fact that you're doing it at your library while all of the other libraries aren't doing it because they don't need it, well, why? But also that makes you look good. Like, be the torchbearer here, like get some bragging rights here, like see if you can appeal to the pride of the library director or something. So hopefully among the variety of these strategies, you will find at least a few to get the library director off your back, but also hopefully like as one of your primary supporters. Question: how do you convince the stubborn board of a small museum to approve paid internships? Okay, so you will notice this is the exact same set of bullet points for the previous question about the library director. And this really, whether it's a board, an 80-year-old professor emeritus, a library director who's very micromanaging about your time, these should hopefully help. Help even the HR department. We can use some of these on the HR department, but this set of strategy is a good place to start. Question: are there examples of winning internship grant proposals? So Any federal grant will have sample applications. So depending on whether you're a library, museum, what have you, checking out like National Endowment for the Humanities, Institute of Museum and Library Services, they have sample grant applications. And if you look for specifically like university or college ones, those will usually include a portion of a paid internship or paid student sort of experience. So I recommend starting there. And then also check in with your peers as well as your network in terms of if you've seen like a peer museum or archive offer paid internship the previous summer, figure out how they did it. If it was grant funded, like ask for the details. We're usually a very sharing group, so that may be another good way to go. And then two, overall, paid internships are, two R's apparently, viewed very favorably by grant reviewers, which you recall I said earlier, honestly, like it's the children. Like if you are funding paid internships and great learning experiences for up and coming professionals, that is viewed very favorably by the granting agency, especially because many of these granting agencies now understand how that impacts diversity, equity, and inclusion, of which they are now trying to robustly support. Question: how do you establish relationships with schools? So there's going to be a program coordinator or liaison position that you can connect with, and each school will have its own version of like an email listserv or a jobs board, and they are usually very happy to post paid internship opportunities for their students. So I would say check out a few of the schools that are somewhat geographically proximate, reach out to whoever their department coordinator is, and keep in mind that even if the school isn't geographically proximate, so many of them are now offering fully online or at least hybrid experiences. And so while the school may be in San Jose and you're in Massachusetts, they may still have San Jose State students, but attending remotely from Massachusetts. So even if there's schools that aren't near you, there could still be potential interns that are. All right, we got through it. Here's your resources. These are the two different IRS links for the common law employee and the grants to individuals, so that award stipend model. These are a great place to start with your reticent HR department. More resources. So if you need more statistics, more arguments, more strategies around the concept of why paid internships is so important and how that impacts equity as well as the entire career trajectory for a vast majority of our population who is of a non-dominant culture, check out these resources. They're arranged, I believe, alphabetically by the last name of the author. We also have a continuation on this second slide. And I do want to highlight this last one here. It was specifically for libraries and archives, and of course, related to museums. And that's Carly Waldenhaus, Wages for Intern Work, Denormalizing Unpaid Positions in Archives and Libraries. So if you want one that's a bit more specific to LAMs, do check that one out. And Carly's got some great strategies and points in there. Resources about the archivist in residence, you can go check that out. I have a Q&A post in terms of why we did what we did. In terms of setting up the paid residency, you can learn more about the residency and also checking out what the residence program is all about. And then resources from my company, we have Ask Me Anything Career Edition, which does cover quite a bit. Economics, our worth, working in this field, the concept of value, etc., as well as the How Much Am I Worth webinar, which was just updated with this year's numbers. So if you need help around that math, go check that webinar out. And then with grants, since internships can be funded by grant work, I do have a grants work template as well as a free ebook, both published by Lucidia Press, that if you go to these links, you can access to get your free e-copy. So if you need help around grant writing, go check that out. For any further questions, follow-up questions, connections, if we haven't already, I'm on LinkedIn and Twitter. All of these webinars are available on YouTube. And if you're not already on the newsletter, I do post all of the webinar and other educational opportunities there first. So please join there. And we will leave this slide up for another couple minutes. I know we've already had an extensive Q&A already and that we're already over time, but if you have any other questions, please feel free to email consulting@rachelchristine.com. And with that, I just want to thank you, everybody, and I wish you luck on establishing your own paid internships. I know that it's not typically a straightforward or easy road, but the more we each do it, the easier it gets for everybody else. And again, like, you're doing the right thing. So I just want to applaud your efforts there and also commiserate with you that sometimes it is very frustrating. So anyway, keep doing the good work. I'll see you all soon. Thanks.